Hello, I'm Karen Giannoni. This is the Iran War Today, our daily briefing bringing you up to date with all you need to know on day 112 of the US-Israel war with Iran. Let's start with some of today's key developments. Israel and Hezbollah agree a ceasefire following concerns that fighting in Lebanon could jeopardize the US-Iran peace deal. But since the truce was agreed, emergency officials say there have been further Israeli strikes in Lebanon. Our correspondents report from on the ground across the country.
60,000 people live in what is usually a very vibrant city, Tyre. But recently, most of them had to flee it for fear of being killed by Israeli strikes.
Peace talks due to take place in Switzerland have been postponed, with US Vice President J.D. Vance not flying out as expected. Tehran warns its finger is still on the trigger. Iran's nuclear program would have been a key topic for those talks in Switzerland. Would 60 days be enough to work it out? We analyse the difficulties. Shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz rises to its highest rate in 2 months, according to maritime trackers. The risk of mines and the risk of another flare-up in hostilities will be issues Gulf producers are thinking hard about. Israel and the Iran-backed group Hezbollah have agreed to a ceasefire after renewed fighting in Lebanon put peace talks between the US and Iran on hold. Lebanon's state news agency described the overnight bombing across the Nabatea district in the south of Lebanon as one of the most intense of the war. We know at least 47 people were killed, more than 100 wounded in the Israeli strikes. Since the truce began, there have been further Israeli strikes in the south. Israel said 4 of its soldiers, including a senior officer, were killed in combat in Lebanon with the Iranian-backed group Hezbollah. From Lebanon, Hugo Bashega reports.
Recent promises of peace in Lebanon have often ended in more war. A country under attack also feels under siege, and the violence here seems to have no end.
We've been here for about 10 minutes and there's been a wave of very intense Israeli airstrikes. We've just heard another one, and we can see the plumes of smoke rising from the locations that have been hit. And now there's also the sound of an Israeli drone flying in the distance.
These rescuers watch and wait. With so many of their colleagues killed on duty, it's simply too dangerous for them to head out.
There were supposed to be a ceasefire, and many people had returned to their homes. This contributed to the increase of casualties. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to reach everyone because of the intensity of the airstrikes on residential areas.
The bombing was in response to the killing of 4 Israeli soldiers by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. As we leave, we see a motorbike still burning and the risky mission to retrieve yet another body. There's now a new ceasefire, but a lasting truce remains elusive. Earlier this week, we had a rare chance to see the part of Lebanon that is under occupation on a humanitarian convoy of the Order of Malta. Israel says it has no intention of pulling its troops out of Lebanon, saying it wants to create a security zone along the border, free of Hezbollah. We saw the Israeli military presence, but were not allowed to film much of the journey. In Shia villages, there's nothing left. Families who've been forced to flee may never be able to come back. The piles of rubble are now a symbol of destroyed buildings, broken promises and lives. Hugo Bashega, BBC News, Southern Lebanon.
Well, BBC Arabic's Karine Torbeh is in Tyre. That's a city in southern Lebanon that's significantly affected by repeated Israeli airstrikes.
This is pretty much how many neighborhoods in Tyre look today. Massive destruction. Of course, Tyre is a city in South Lebanon. Not just any city, it's one of the oldest in the world, but it's also one that is very famous for its beach, for its cafes, restaurants, hotels, for its old town, and of course, for its ruins, Roman ruins, because this city is a very rich one in culture and in history. In normal times, around 60,000 people live in what is usually a very vibrant city, Tyre. But recently, most of them had to flee it for fear of being killed by Israeli strikes. Israel says it is actually targeting Hezbollah's infrastructure, but it has issued a blanket evacuation order, which led most of the residents of this city to leave it. 2 days ago, some of them returned to check on their properties, on their houses, on their neighborhoods. And just today, some of them had to flee again, to be displaced one more time following the Israeli attacks.
Karine Torbay. Well, in a moment, we'll hear from our correspondents Charlotte Gallagher in Jerusalem and Tom Bateman in Washington. But first, here's Israel's international spokesperson in the United Nations, Jonathan Harunoff, speaking to us before the ceasefire announcement on that fighting in Lebanon.
The reality is that there were 4 Israelis who were killed by Hezbollah, and as a reaction to that, Israel responded by striking some 80 Hezbollah targets. Israel has no beef with the people of Lebanon. It has no territorial expansionist aspirations. It wants peace with its neighbors, but there is an organization, an internationally designated terrorist organization inside Lebanon dictating the future of the Lebanese people, and that's coming from the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that's a very dangerous thing. And so long as that threat exists sitting on Israel's border, which is a tiny country, Israel cannot ignore that threat, and it has to respond accordingly.
Well, let's talk to our correspondents, Charlotte Gallagher, who's in Jerusalem, and Tom Bateman in Washington. Charlotte, first to you. We hear there are still Israeli strikes taking place despite the ceasefire being agreed with Hezbollah.
Yeah, there are, Karen. I mean, within minutes of that ceasefire being announced, we heard that there had been strikes in southern Lebanon. The Lebanese state media and also the local ambulance service for Nabatea, a city in southern Lebanon, they said that there had been 12 Israeli airstrikes since the ceasefire was announced. And it's not hard to see why this ceasefire, if you can call it a ceasefire, is faltering. So Israel says it will not withdraw troops from southern Lebanon while Hezbollah is still there. They say Hezbollah poses too much of a threat, especially to people in North Israel living on the border with Lebanon. And Hezbollah say they will not disarm while Israeli troops are inside Lebanon. So they're at a stalemate, really, aren't they? So I think that's why any ceasefire really at the moment is destined to fail, but it's really difficult to describe something as a truce or a ceasefire when you hear about multiple airstrikes being carried out in minutes. Benjamin Netanyahu under real pressure because Donald Trump, he wants him to stop the fighting in southern Lebanon. He doesn't want anything derailing his talks with Iran and a peace deal. And then inside Israel, this potential peace deal is very unpopular, not just with politicians, but also with the Israeli public. They feel that it's selling them out. Essentially, it makes them vulnerable. It makes them constrained. And a lot of them want the offensive to continue in southern Lebanon. We heard from Ben Gvir, a far-right cabinet minister. He said today the whole of Lebanon should burn. So very strong words from him, but also moderate Israeli politicians saying they want the offensive to continue as well.
And Tom, to you in Washington, do you think the Trump administration was prepared for how much of an issue Lebanon has become?
Well, I mean, not really. When you look at the sort of start of the war by the US and the Israelis, because the Americans, I don't think, would have started it for multiple reasons, but particularly if they felt that there was going to be this huge fracture with their Israeli ally towards the end of it. And that is largely because of the fundamental strategic problems this has created Donald Trump in that this war has not worked for him. And so now you're seeing this distance created between him and the Israelis, in part because I think of the frustrations of all of the problems that have been thrown up by Iran's ability to resist the US and Israeli attack more broadly. But this is really fundamentally playing out, being aggravated at its most acute form in Lebanon. And part of the reason these ceasefires have become meaningless is because the Americans, as they have sort of taken on this role of mediating between Israel and the government of Lebanon here in Washington, when they've announced these apparent ceasefires, they contain a whole list of mitigating factors for the Israelis, saying things like Israel has the right to defend itself, it can attack Hezbollah positions if it thinks it is going to be attacked, but nothing of the equivalent on the Hezbollah side or the Lebanese side. So the these have been extremely one-sided, basically, and the Israelis have interpreted that as meaning it's sort of open season when it comes to what these ceasefires actually mean, and it just hasn't worked. I mean, Israel, for its part, will say that Hezbollah has continued to fire on it, particularly within southern Lebanon, but that is an area under occupation by the Israelis, whose forces invaded earlier during this campaign. And particularly with this particular incident, I mean, Hezbollah say that the Israelis were trying to infiltrate a strategic area. That's when they fired these anti-tank missiles, which have killed 4 Israeli soldiers, including a battalion commander. So you've got a senior level figure there. And the Israelis in these airstrikes have now killed up to 50 people in Lebanon. So the intensity of that kind of fighting is simply not going to be contained by a so-called ceasefire suddenly announced. It is another reason why Donald Trump is simply not in control of events. Events are controlling him in this, and why I think he's shown, that all threatens to derail his much needed deal with the Iranians at the moment, that memorandum of understanding. And it is why he has been becoming increasingly angry and frustrated and taking it out very publicly on Benjamin Netanyahu.
Tom, thank you very much. Tom Bateman in Washington, Charlotte Gallagher in Jerusalem. There were 2 issues that US Vice President J.D. Vance listed yesterday as Washington's priorities regarding Tehran, that it stops funding regional instability, funding regional terrorism, he said, and trying to rebuild their nuclear weapons program. That's the main thing, he said. The text of the Memorandum of Understanding only commits Iran to downblending its stockpile of highly enriched uranium under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the IAEA. A senior US official has called it a significant concession by Iran. In a moment, we will get analysis from BBC Persian's Khazra Naji, but first, here is the Labour peer, Baroness Catherine Ashton, who's worked as the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security and led talks on Iran's nuclear programme.
One of the big features of the negotiations way back in 2014-15 and the 4 years that I was involved with them was the IAEA. We consulted them all the time, and they were a clear partner because they were going to do all of the ensuring that Iran stuck to the deal. So they had inspectors, we had cameras, we had a huge amount of activity that meant it was incredibly difficult for Iran to do anything that might have suggested they were moving away from a civil nuclear program to a weapons-based program. And the inspectors going back in is critical to all of this. It's critical not only that they go back, but that they stay there. And in terms of where you now might put cameras, where you might have continuous feed to them of what is happening. There's so much detail to do, and that's why it took us so long to negotiate the agreement, because you need a lot of people with a lot of technical knowledge and a lot of expertise to be able to put together an agreement of this kind. And even just within the MOU, huge questions about how this would be done. And although I'm a firm believer we should try and get an agreement, get the Straits of Hormuz open and move forward, there's going to be so much to do that one can imagine it will take much longer than the 60 days they've given themselves.
Well, let's speak to Khazra Naji from BBC Persian from Emerton, near where today's talks were due to take place in Switzerland. Khazra, was the nuclear issue due to be the main element?
Yes, the American side wants the Iranian nuclear program dismantled and its enriched uranium diluted and sent abroad, basically put an end to nuclear activities in Iran. This is not something Iran is willing to agree. We had 3 or 4 rounds of talks before the war started, and they didn't get anywhere regarding this. In 2015, when there was a JCPOA agreement, there was a deal that for substantial lifting of international sanctions against Iran, Iran agreed to limit its substantially limit its nuclear program, a number of centrifuges, the stock of enriched uranium. There was a cap on how high Iran could enrich 3.67 way from 90% that Iran needs for a nuclear bomb. And on top of that, Iran agreed to a substantial oversight by the IAEA inspectors, and that made it sort of agreeable to the 6 world powers, including Russia and China, that they don't have to worry about Iran's nuclear program for many years. But obviously, President Trump decided to withdraw from that in 2018, and now we're back to square one in a sense that the US wants Iran's nuclear program dismantled altogether. We will see whether that is achievable, and also wants the stock of enriched uranium, particularly 440 kilogram of 60% enriched uranium, to be shipped abroad. These are very difficult choices for the Iranian side, and I'm not sure that the negotiations are going to be easy.
Khazra, thank you very much. Khazra Naji from BBC Persian there in Switzerland. A key outcome of the US-Iran agreement is that oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz are beginning to pick up. Several tankers have entered the waterway, but traffic remains well below normal, with a backlog of vessels still waiting. Iran has waived shipping fees for 60 days, but access is still tightly controlled. Ships must request permission in advance and follow specified routes because of ongoing safety risks, including sea mines. Well, shipping can flow through Hormuz because of the agreement set out in the Memorandum of Understanding that Iran will not attack vessels and the US will lift its naval blockade. The threat to Hormuz has proven a potent weapon of war for Iran's hardline leadership, as has Hezbollah's support for the regime from Lebanon. As we've been reporting, fighting in Lebanon led to the cancellation of talks scheduled to take place in Switzerland between American and Iranian negotiators. Does the ceasefire mean these talks can now progress? My colleague Christian Fraser sent this update from Lucerne.
Well, Corinne, I think the resumption of the ceasefire does clear a path for the talks to resume here in Switzerland. They were postponed today with all the violence that we've seen across the border in Lebanon. But now we really are preparing for the talks to resume. So I should set the scene for you. You'll see behind me this huge mountainside. Just above the quarry is a ridge, and behind that ridge, high up on the mountainside, is a resort with this commanding view over Lake Lucerne, which will be the venue for the talks. It's owned by the Qatari government, which presumably is why we are here. And there is a ring of steel around it. The Swiss military have been circling in the helicopters through the day. There are Swiss diplomats up there ready and waiting. So everything is in place for the talks to resume. Let's bring in Mikey Kay from the Security Brief, who's been here with me today. Donald Trump says Lebanon is a small problem, easy to fix. And he may have fixed it for now, but a resumption of the ceasefire, we've seen that before, and it does feel to me as if it is the weak part of the agreement.
Yeah, military parlance, Christian, we call that a critical vulnerability. And it's a critical vulnerability because it requires the US to rein in Israel, and it requires Iran to rein in Hezbollah. And if Hezbollah or Israel decide to sort of break that truce, then effectively you're back to square one. And Trump absolutely does not want that. You know, we've heard about proxies right at the very beginning. We're in Geneva. We know the importance of reining in the proxies, but that's not an easy thing to do. And if you're going to commit a war tactically using air power alone, and you're not prepared to put boots on the ground, and we saw, you know, boots on the ground in Iraq, for example, it was over 10 years of warfare and it didn't rein in the militias there. It's still not a guarantee, even putting boots on the ground, that you're going to overcome this problem. So the whole problem about the tactical versus strategy thing is that the Operation Epic Fury was sort of half-baked. It was relying on air power to achieve some of those objectives. But, you know, as you rightly say, when it comes to Hezbollah and the proxies, it requires way more than air power to deal with that problem.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about tactics, because there is a saying, tactics before strategy is the noise before failure. Do you think the problems that Donald Trump encountered in the Strait of Hormuz, which he was warned about by General Dan Kane ahead of the war, led us to this document and Lebanon being clause 1 in the agreement?
Yeah, that's a classic Sun Tzu quote that you just had there. A similar sort of thing. It's not the first time we've sort of seen this thing in history. Go back to the Vietnam War, and the quotes that were coming out of that were, "We're winning the battles, but we're losing the war." And it just goes back to the strategy versus tactics. Look, you can have the most powerful conventional military in the world, the US, $1 trillion defense budget, $1.5 trillion in 2027. But if your tactical missions are not aligning to the higher level strategy, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And I think with the Strait of Hormuz that you particularly mentioned, it wasn't mentioned in any of the preconditions, the threats in Geneva before February the 28th. It wasn't mentioned subsequently, and it's actually really become a thorn in Trump's side and his Achilles heel where we are today.
No doubt Lebanon is Iran's leverage. If Donald Trump is to retain some leverage, that is clearly through the military force he's built up in the region. But he's withdrawn some of the blockade. How much more does he leave in theatre over the next 60 days?
Three key aspects to that. He's got to keep eyes on to the nuclear facilities. So he'll have to have drones, imagery intelligence, we call it. So MQ-9 Reapers. He's lost 20 of those actually during the Operation Epic Fury. You're going to have to. He's threatening Iran with bombing. If anything breaks down. In order to keep that credible, you've got to have B-1s and B-52 stationed at RAF Airford in the UK. They're not going to be able to go back to the States. They've got to keep forward deployed in order to counter and keep his threats credible.
That's Mikey Kay talking to Christian Fraser in Switzerland. So diplomatic efforts in Switzerland put on pause. A lasting peace deal for the Middle East jeopardised potentially by the situation in Lebanon. There has now been a ceasefire agreed, but what are the chances that the hoped-for transformative relationship between Tehran and Washington could be smothered by further hostilities elsewhere? Well, with me is Lise Doucette, our chief international correspondent. Hello to you, Lise. And how much jeopardy is this deal in?
From the very moment of its signing, and it's been signed a few times, signed digitally, then signed by the leaders separately, and then there was to be another signing in Switzerland, which now seems to be postponed. It was always recognized that as much of an achievement as it was always going to be fraught with risk. And right from the get-go, we're only day 2 of that 60-day window where Iran and the United States are meant to sit down and negotiate more intensively on some of the biggest outstanding issues, most of all the fate of Iran's nuclear program. But while we have seen a delay today, Karen, I don't think we can say that the deal is in danger. Washington wants this deal to stick. The fact that you had almost immediately a ceasefire announced between Israel and Hezbollah understands that the phones were burning, that President Trump and his team and the Qatari mediators got on the phone to both sides and said, you've got to stop firing. You cannot jeopardize the deal. Iran as well wants this to stick because, bear in mind, it also benefits from the Strait of Hormuz opening. Its tankers are already flowing. It has waivers to allow it to export its crude oil and petroleum products. But this emphasizes yet again that Iran has its red lines. It's not going to budge, and that includes that Lebanon must be part of this.
Lise, thank you very much. Lise Doucette, our Chief International Correspondent. And of course, there is so much more, whether you're joining us on YouTube, TikTok, Sounds, radio or TV. Thank you very much for being with us. We will be back at the same time tomorrow with the Iran War Today.